Today I'm reviewing The Hobbit by J R R Tolkien. I have two copies of it. The one I read this time was this one, and it's a good copy to read because it's in better condition than my old one. It's got the illustration of Smaug the dragon sitting on his hoard, and it's got a number of illustrations that are, as well as the cover, by J R R Tolkien himself, which my original copy doesn't have. So this was the copy that I grew up with. This is a Puffin book. It was published, I think, in 61. Let me just check that one. Yes, this one was published in 1961. It was read to me by my father, who was a complete and utter J R R Tolkien fan. He was right into epic fantasy, science fiction, the lot. I inherited it from him and to a lesser extent from my mother. Now, this copy of The Hobbit has no illustrations. Its only illustration really is the cover, which is no longer entirely attached since it's been read and reread all these years. The cover is noteworthy because it is actually quite a beautiful piece of art, and it's a wraparound piece of art designed by an English author specifically for this book. I'll get onto that later. So this was the book that I got read as a bedtime story before I could read. This was one of the books that I read for myself once I could read. No illustrations, but very much beloved. So, as a fairy story for a little baby girl, I think it worked well. It may result in a lot of my later choices in life, but basically it would have been my first epic quest type novel, as well as one of my first fantasy novels, and the writing in it is spectacularly beautiful and never grows old. So while this is generally known and published as a fantasy novel, it, like Peter Pan and a couple of other ones, is now mostly remembered as a children's book or a children's fantasy. Despite that, it's beautifully written. As well as an epic fantasy quest, this, I find out, is an example of a coming-of-age quest. So J R R Tolkien would have known it as a Bildungsroman. I can't speak German, and it's a German word, so I'm probably mispronouncing it. But that's basically a literary genre which focuses on the psychological and moral growth of the protagonist from childhood to adulthood, so that making it a coming of age. So in that type of quest, character growth is very important, and you see a lot of character growth here, primarily from Bilbo Baggins, because it's about Bilbo and his quest, but you see it in others. There's no way to deny that Thorin Oakenshield himself sees character development. He goes from being a nomad to being king under the mountain to, as a new king who's just realised his dream and is in possession of a dragon's hoard of treasure, he makes some poor decision makings, but he repents of them in the end. So you've got character development there, but you've got character development as well. You've got Bard. He has a character arc. It's a short one toward the end of the novel, but he and many others do as well. Now, I'm not going to worry about spoilers. This book's been around a long time. I don't think that everyone knows the actual story, but I think most people think they do. The book is very different from the movie. I don't want to discuss the movie. I don't discuss movies. I'm just going to say one thing about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Movies versus books. I find it's a personal amusement to me that The Hobbit was first published and was immensely popular. It had reprintings. It was published during the war when there were shortages of paper. It was still immensely popular, immensely published. It's still immensely popular. It's always on one of the top kids' books of all time. The reason The Lord of the Rings, the book, existed, and here it is in much battered condition, it exists almost solely because The Hobbit was so popular that the publishers, that was George Allen and Unwin, who published the original first edition of The Hobbit on the 21st of September 1937, There we go. It had an original print one of 1,500 copies, and they sold out by December because of good reviews and because there was such enthusiastic response from the public. Really, what The Hobbit did had never been done before. There were other children's books, there were other fantasy books, but what The Hobbit was for its point in time in the late 30s, I don't really think you'd had anything like it before. Anyway, so that first printing was illustrated in black and white only and by Tolkien, and he designed the dust cover for it as well. Because that was so popular, George Allen and Unwin requested a follow-up, and that follow-up ended up being, in the end, Lord of the Rings. So I find it amusing that Lord of the Rings would never have existed if The Hobbit hadn't been so popular, but the movies is the reverse. We had Peter Jackson making Lord of the Rings, and that was so popular that the movie company, who I've forgotten which one it was, asked for more, and they got The Hobbit. So I find that amusing. I have a strange sense of humour. Whatever. Okay, my other copy, and the one I just finished, is The Hobbit. I've already shown you that. Have I already shown you that? That's a beautiful edition because it's got Tolkien illustrations on it, Smaug on his hoard there, and a whole heap inside, even though there's not actually any back illustration. It was intact before I took it camping, but there you go. That's what happens to my books because I read them. Okay, so this, my childhood cover, is actually designed and painted by an artist called Pauline Baynes, who was born in 1922 and died in 2008. She's a fascinating and really underrated artist. She became a commercial artist after the war, and she contributed paintings and drawings to more than 200 books, mostly I think children's books, but her artwork is absolutely spectacular. She did the illustrations for the Narnia books, which I have. They were written by C.S. Lewis, who was charmed by The Hobbit and influenced by it, but she also did illustrations for The Princess and the Goblin, which is also up there, and which charmed and influenced Tolkien in the writing of The Hobbit, so it's all very circular. She was the first illustrator of some of Tolkien's minor works, like I think it's Leaf by Nigel, those sort of ones, and some of the poetry. She really should be better known, I feel. While I really enjoy Tolkien's illustrations, and the publishers wanted them and kept asking for them and kept bowing to his demands to put more in, even though there was paper shortages, in many respects I think Pauline actually did better work, though she didn't end up illustrating Lord of the Rings or any of Tolkien's later more adult work. She was primarily a children's editor. He approved her work after he dismissed other illustrators after meeting her in person and liking her and her ideas. Rightio, enough about the artwork. So let's talk about the writing a bit. Now, Tolkien was an academic, and I think that really is the reason why The Hobbit is such a marvellous book in its own right, and so richly and beautifully written. It's written for children. It works as a bedtime story. It's got that over narrator that many children's books do have, and it's got concepts that are very suited for children. Like, the characters are diminished in a way. Bilbo Baggins is made more funny and food obsessed than he is in Lord of the Rings, perhaps. The dwarves are children's dwarves. Instead of having orcs, he's got goblins, and they're terrifying and scary and bad, but they're also a little bit funny. Their songs are, can I say this word, onomatopoeic? That's it. Like crash, bash, black crack, things that make you think of something basic and nasty. So it is very much a children's book. But Tolkien's extensive academia is what makes it a rich, beautiful book. So he studied writing and he studied languages, and it's not really surprising that Hobbit has got such a wealth of background sources. But those sources, what is impressive about it is how much he made them his own and how unique they are to his own vision, rather than just being rephrasings of old sources. And you can see that in a lot of books, they've got a lot of sources, but the sources are so obvious that it almost seems to chop and change. It isn't integrated into the story. No one can accuse The Hobbit of not being an integrated story. It is. So he probably had more sources than I would recognise or be able to enumerate, but I'll mention one or two. The first is Beowulf. It's an old English epic poem. It's a Germanic heroic tradition poem. It's now very famous. It's considered important. There's still a lot of argument about exactly when its source was, but it's one of the apparently most translated works from Old English literature. Tolkien was one of the first to recognise its importance. When Tolkien was in academia, there were arguments about when Beowulf had been written for how reliable his source material was, but there was very little interest taken in Beowulf as an actual literary work of its own right. Tolkien was one of the first, and a lot of that epic poem element comes into The Hobbit and later into Lord of the Rings. Now, the thing that I find particularly exciting about Tolkien is how influenced he was by Norse mythology, because I got into Norse mythology much later in life and North European history. But when I finally made my way there, so much of it seemed familiar, like something I'd met before. And I credit J R R Tolkien with that. He was incredibly influenced by the prose Edda and the poetic Edda. So the prose Edda is an Old Norse textbook. It was written in Iceland almost certainly by Snorri Sturluson, and though it was written in the early 13th century, the work is considered to have been sourced from much earlier, possibly written, or at least compiled and spoken stories. So it's as close as we really have to written down Norse mythology, and the Poetic Edda is a modern name for an untitled collection of Old Norse anonymous narrative poems. It's distinct from the Prose Edda. I've read both, and I've read a couple of other things. They are written old style and old school, and though there have been a couple of attempts to modernise them, I don't think you can go better than J R R Tolkien. J R R Tolkien modernised the stories a little bit because the stories are influenced here, but what he really did was he took the thrill, the emotion, the gist of what a story is, and he infused that into his Middle Earth. So there's so much you could say about this. There's whole books written about The Hobbit. So one small YouTube video from a person who isn't an academic is only going to scratch the surface, really. Regarding the Norse interpretations, I think having Tolkien's illustrations to look at really cements it. Now, I know he used his own style of runes in some of the books as well, but this is Hill's illustration for Beorn's Hall. The way it's described, I as an adult can recognise the Norse influence, but if you look at that illustration, that is basically a Viking hall, like you'll see it in any number of Viking museums around the world, like the ones I've visited in the Baltic, like the ones I'd like to visit in Norway. So in Beorn you can see a lot of the Viking style home living that they came from in order to go Viking. So that's very Norse. What else should I say about it? I want to say so much. It's a wonderful book. So known as kids' book, reads like a kid's book. Despite that, despite the fact that I'm a full adult reading this book, and it reads like a kid's book, it reads like Bilbo Baggins' story is being told to a child at night. And I don't know if that's my background because that's how it was first told to me, or because it's designed that way. I think it's designed that way. Despite that, the literary quality is so exceptional. The characters are in many ways more adult than a lot of the ones you'll see today. There's a moral ambiguity to all the characters, but especially to Bilbo and to Thorin. Bilbo, because we see most of him. It's like he is by his own lights honest and just, and he emphasises that later in the book, though not so much in the beginning. There's your coming of age style character development as well. But small things like, when is it okay to steal? When isn't it okay to steal? There are less than heroic characteristics to all the characters, but especially to the dwarves. The dwarves are Bilbo's friends and they're his co-travelers, but all of them have got things that you can't really look upon as highly moral characteristics, and that's what you see in the Eddas and in all stories as well. There are very few characters, if there are any. I don't think there's a single one, heroic or not, who is an unambiguously good character. Their gods are terrifying and bad and tricksy. Their main characters are sometimes appalling, as well as murderers and just plain nasty. So this ambiguity makes the characters nuanced and complex, and that contributes to your feeling of reading an adult story, even at the same time that you can understand the kids' elements to it. It's actually a level of sophistication that not only do you often not see in kids' books today, where the publisher's idea or the storyteller's idea is that children's characters need to be black or white, good or bad. You also see that in young adult, where motivations and characters tend to be intensely oversimplified. But you see it in adult books as well. There's a number of very popular authors who will only write good into the good characters and bad into the bad characters. But Tolkien was better than that. He knew that the world wasn't that simple, and he knew that kids in general do not accept it. Too much sugar doesn't feel real, but too much bile doesn't either. And I'm going to just quickly plug a lot of fantasy. I'm reading another fantasy at the moment that hasn't figured out. There's no sugar at all. It's all bile. And that is as unrealistic as a childish, sugary story in which everyone's really good. So yes, anyway. Enough ranting about modern books. So this often adult fantasy quest has an integrity for the whole of the story that is deeply satisfying, and which I would say exceeds the satisfaction that you can get from Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is a much more adult fantasy and quest. The characters are much more adult. The scenarios are much more grim and scary. But as a single work in its own right, it doesn't hold together too much. A lot of the adventures are more fun and more adult, but the way this book holds together as one beautiful little piece is not really anywhere there in Lord of the Rings. And even though it's a kid's book, and it's not that long, it's 200 and something pages, I think? 283 pages. This isn't a fast book to read. Took me as long to get through those pages as it has taken me to get through some 500-page books, because the writing is beautiful and you can't just glance over it. The writing is its own integral part of the plot. It isn't just a way of getting information from the page into your brain, it's a way of stimulating your enjoyment. Oh yes. So anyone who's read it or knows of it, of the book, not the movie, will know that there's a whole heap of songs and poems, as well as the riddling game that happens between Gollum and Bilbo. Those were not things that I enjoyed as a kid. I was impatient with them. I'd often skim read them. The riddles not so much, but the long stories, the long songs where the dwarves sing about their treasure, I wasn't really into them. I just didn't dig them. As an adult, I think that those songs and stories and poems do an excellent job of scene setting and explaining character motivation, because the dwarves have their own quest and their own story arc, and a lot of their motivations come through in the songs in the way that they never do, because as characters their main interactions are conversations with Bilbo, but the songs tell you who they are and what they're all about. What else? Oh yes, in this rereading I noticed that there's a few deviations from the world building that you get in Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. The later books build Middle-earth as a real country with a real history in a way that The Hobbit obviously doesn't. This is a kid's book. You don't need that much history. You need the story. And especially with the wood elves. It really stood out for me with the wood elves because in The Hobbit, Tolkien specifically says that the wood elves are a lesser type of elf than their western cousins because they'd stayed in the world and not going west. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure many people know the back histories for Middle-earth better than I do, but my understanding is that all the elves on Middle-earth came together from Valinor? Valinor? I've never said it before, I've only ever read it. Now, some of them went to Westernese, but Westernese was a combination of elf and human habitation, so I don't think that the elves that came from Westernese should have been seen as higher elves than the ones that didn't go there. That seemed to me a bit of a quirk in his world building, and there were a few others. Now, from what I've read about The Hobbit, he hadn't developed Middle-earth fully at the stage when he wrote The Hobbit. He continued developing later, and the very early editions, which I'd love to get my hands on and have a look at, have a few deviations from later canon because he kept sending in amendments to future publishings of the Hobbits. And one of those amendments is a very important one for Lord of the Rings, though not as much for The Hobbit. So it's my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected on it, that the riddle game between Gollum and Bilbo, which is such a pivotal part of Bilbo's development, such a pivotal part of the entire Lord of the Rings series, Lord of the Rings couldn't exist without that riddle game. That riddle game is where the High Ring came into Bilbo's possession, which otherwise Lord of the Rings just doesn't exist. My understanding is that in the original writing of that part, Gollum agreed to play the riddle game with the ring as the prize. Whereas, of course, in The Hobbit as we know it today, Gollum's prize was being allowed to eat Bilbo Baggins. And Bilbo didn't even know he had the ring. Now, as a child, I always thought that was a little bit shady. I didn't understand how anyone would agree to be eaten for any game whatsoever. But, I mean, I would love to see how all of that sequence is played out in the original story. And there's other amendments, I'm sure, as well. But still, I've got to say, whether you've got the one with the illustrations... Oh, I'm going to share another illustration. I don't actually have any of the Tolkien illustrations as pictures. I kind of wish I do now. This is one of my favourites. This is the image of the gate into the Lonely Mountain as the dwarves see it after marching up from Lake Town. And that's a stunning drawing. I particularly noticed that Tolkien likes using those line contours to delineate rocks and geology. And that, I think, is very similar to the way Tibetan art and a lot of other Asian art delineates that. So I don't know if Tolkien was into the Asian arts or if that's just something integral to humanity. Anyway, that's interesting. Yes, so, as I was saying, whichever book you have, whichever illustrations you possess, and they're gorgeous illustrations, whether it's Pauline's work or whether it's Tolkien's work, gorgeous illustrations. This is a great book. It's got to be a runner-up for one of my favourite ever books. I've been reading and rereading it for all of my life. Every time there's more to it. And it is beautifully written. Better written than many other books that are considered to be literature these days. So, comment, subscribe. Disagree with anything that I said. I'm perfectly willing to have a conversation about The Hobbit anytime.